Dark Souls 1 is a punishing dark fantasy action RPG. You play as a zombie, exploring an ancient and dying world rich with hidden lore, but subdued in its storytelling style. As you defeat enemies, you accrue experience points, or souls, which can be used to level up and purchase items. You'll find equipment throughout the game, and eventually you'll converge on a unique playstyle depending on your choice of weapons, magic, and armor. Despite being primarily single-player, you're connected to other players online via messages written on the ground, and can engage in limited co-op and PvP invasions. In a typical 2-hour or so session playing this game, you'll explore the game world by traveling between checkpoints, or bonfires. There are enemies, traps, puzzles, and bosses between each bonfire that bar your progress. Travel between two bonfires is almost never trivial. You will die repeatedly as you learn the level design and enemy patterns well enough to survive. Whenever you respawn at a bonfire, nearly all of the enemies you defeated, except for bosses and mini-bosses, respawn with you, but so do many of your otherwise limited resources like spells and healing flasks. Dying causes you to drop your souls or experience points, but if you're able to reach the point where you died, you can recover them, similar to corpse runs in classic MMOs. If you die again before reaching your souls, they're lost forever, but souls spent on leveling up and purchasing items can never be lost. You'll constantly be making risk versus reward assessments. You'll say, I've got a lot of souls, but I'm running low on resources. I don't know how close the next checkpoint is. Should I return to the bonfire to spend my souls and level up, and then deal with this entire level all over again? Or should I risk pushing just a little bit further to see if there's another checkpoint, and risk losing all my souls on the way? So I like to talk about game's Cathartic Milestones. These are major achievements that you can look forward to while playing the game that would make a given session feel productive, so to speak. So in Dark Souls, I would say those milestones are reaching bonfires or checkpoints, finding shortcuts, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and defeating the non-respawning bosses and mini-bosses. These represent points of permanent progress in the game, and you'll feel very accomplished in having done them. Now, when it comes to the audience that should play Dark Souls, I really want to say that everyone should play this game, but I really can't do that. Dark Souls is for patient gamers who get a cathartic endorphin rush after triumphing over difficult and often frustrating content. You don't just feel relieved when you finally win after failing for hours, you feel overjoyed. So if that's not you, maybe Dark Souls isn't for you. To be clear though, Dark Souls is very difficult, but it's also fair. It's not NES hard in the sense the difficulty isn't really artificial, like how in a lot of NES games there are limited continues. It's not so much that the game is hard, it's just you get so many tries before you have to start over from the beginning. And it's also not difficult because of bugginess or poor design. The game is actually remarkably well designed. 99% of the time when you die, it's really clear that it's your fault that you died, and you know exactly what you did wrong and how you should change it on your next attempt, even if you have trouble on executing on that. So if you're the sort of gamer who gets a thrill at overcoming repeated failure, then I would say this game has something for everybody. Before I get into the something for everybody part, though, I do want to point out that I think the difficulty of Dark Souls is a little bit overblown, and if you're the sort of gamer that kind of just wants to play through the story and see what the game's all about, you're a little bit less patient or a little bit less masochistic than maybe I am. Although the game doesn't have a difficulty slider traditionally, there are a lot of ways to make the game easier than it seems. For example, all of the bosses in the game are balanced around a single player attempting them, even though the game makes it really easy for you to summon other players to help you fight them. And if you don't want to play online, you can always summon NPCs to fight you for basically every boss in the game. Since they're not balanced for two players, having a second player makes many of the boss fights completely trivial, just because the boss is now focusing on one player and the other player can beat on them in the meantime. Similarly, the game does not require grinding at all. In fact, you can beat the entire game at level 1, and it's not that much different from a standard playthrough. But if you do choose to grind, the game makes it very easy to do so, and you can make the game easier by leveling up more, buying better armor, upgrading your weapons and armor, that sort of thing. So I think that this game is playable if you're not a super masochist like I am. Just be willing to go into it and say, I'm okay with summoning other players if I get frustrated or grinding for a bit. When thinking about the audience for video games, I've taken a page from Bartle's taxonomy of player types and tried to think about what people want from playing video games, right? And I've come up with 6 categories, and they're achievement, exploration, flavor, mechanics, style or polish, and hype. People who want achievement are looking for ways to level up, get more powerful, to collect all the things, to be a completionist, 100% games, that sort of thing. So Dark Souls absolutely ticks all those boxes, I think. It's fundamentally, it's an RPG about leveling up, becoming more powerful, and overcoming obstacles over time. There are a ton of ways to progress through the game and try to collect everything. 100%ing Dark Souls feels rewarding for the most part, as nearly all of its side content is unique. It's not an RPG where you're asked to do a bunch of redundant side quests. You're not, collecting 10 bear asses in this game. And if you're looking for a satisfying playthrough, but don't necessarily want to earn every achievement, because there is a little bit of grinding as far as, finding all the weapons and upgrading them, for example. The most rewarding thing I think you can do in Dark Souls is to find and defeat every boss in the game. That will get you to find almost all of the zones that you can explore, and all the bosses are really unique content that's definitely worth playing. People looking for exploration, on the other hand, are less interested with collecting things and doing all the points. They just want to see what the game world has to offer. They want to see what's around every corner, and they might not even be that interested in beating the game. And again, I think that Dark Souls is a great sandbox to play in for that. This game is unique among games I've played in the way exploration feels. There's an inherent danger to exploring in Dark Souls that I don't really get in almost any other game that I play, with the way that the level design is set up and the world is set up. You are safest in areas that are familiar to you in this game. If you know the enemy patterns, if you know the zone, you can move through it fairly carefully. But if it's a corner you've never turned before, there could be a trap, there could be an enemy waiting in ambush, and as you progress from checkpoint to checkpoint, you get to know these levels very well because you've repeated them so many times. Even if you're really good or you luck out and you get through the first half of a level easily without dying, if you die in the second half, you have to trek your way back to the first half again anyway. So this is one of the few games where I have an almost perfect map of the whole game in my brain a year after playing it. I played Donkey Kong Country 20 times as a kid, and I don't think I can really tell you the order of the levels, the level names, where all the enemies are. I have a light memory of it, but nothing as intense as I have of Dark Souls, where I really know where all the staircases are, where all the enemies are, where all the bosses are, where a lot of the important items are, that sort of thing. So I think this really has something unique for explorers, because it's exciting to see what's going to be around the next corner. This game really doesn't do cutscenes that show you the game world. You just kind of walk in and, oh shit, there's a volcano, there's lava everywhere, there's a giant ghost monster. It just sort of happens as you're moving around, and I think that's pretty brilliant. So if you like to explore, I think Dark Souls is absolutely for you. Flavor to me is the story, what the world is like, how the world tells its story. If you were to remove all the game mechanics from the game, what do you have left over? To me, that's flavor. And Dark Souls is an intensely flavorful setting. It has a very subdued, hands-off approach to storytelling that I love. You all know the whole show-don't-tell obsession that I have. It uses cutscenes incredibly sparingly. There are few NPCs in the game, and when they're there, they speak to you briefly. You'll probably spend less than 1/10% of Dark Souls talking to NPCs or watching cutscenes. And yet the world is very rich and interesting to explore. Pretty much the way you find out about lore is through things like enemy placement or enemy behaviors. You might be walking down a hallway and see an enemy that's prostrated facing a door, and you're like, what are they praying to? What's that all about? What the hell? Or there might be an enemy that doesn't aggro until you loot a certain item, and then you read the item description and it gives you some context into what's going on. But the game is very careful to never tell you this is what's happening. It's up to you to figure that stuff out, and you're probably not going to catch on to most of it in your first, second, or third playthrough of the game. So if you're the kind of gamer where you want the flavor to be served to you, like spoon-fed with cutscenes and dialogue, you might not like Dark Souls as much. I think it's really possible, if you're not immersing yourself in the game, to play through the whole thing without knowing anything that's going on. But that's actually kind of exciting to me. I love finishing a game and then being able to get on the forums or get on Reddit and talk about what just happened and have those aha moments where someone else says, hey, did you know that if you equip this item in this place, this crazy thing happens? So yeah, I think that Dark Souls is a winner for sure when it comes to flavor. Mechanics to me are the exact opposite. If you strip a game of all of its story and flavor, what's left over? If you played it with wireframes, would it still be fun? And I think the answer absolutely there is yes. If you played Dark Souls like an arcade game and skipped what dialogue and cutscenes there were and just tried to beat it, you would have a lot of fun doing so. It's really fun to optimize. The combat is well tuned. It's based around having a stamina system where every single action you take consumes stamina, and it limits the amount of things that you can do within a certain window of time. If you're used to playing video games by button mashing, Dark Souls will very quickly disabuse you of that habit. It remembers if you press the attack button twice quickly in a panic, and will often see you attacking twice, even if you don't actually intend to do so. You have to commit to actions in Dark Souls. There is no way to cancel out of animations like you might see. If you look superficially at a game like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, you might say, how is that different from Dark Souls? And I think that action canceling is a big part of it. Once you have swung with your sword, your characters are going to go through a lengthy animation where they start the swing and they end the swing, and you're not going to be able to roll out of that or otherwise, dodge it, block attacks once you have chosen to attack. So I think the game is really rich. You can see that from its very active speedrunning community. People have a lot of fun playing this game, getting good at this game, and doing so in lots of creative ways. There have been streamers that have played it with DDR controllers, with Donkey Konga bongos, with voice commands was a pretty funny one. So yeah, if you are interested just in the mechanics, is this a tight game to play? Is it, well-tuned? And the answer is absolutely yes again. Now, style and polish is an area where I think the first Dark Souls game at least suffers the most. I can't with a straight face tell you that Dark Souls is a polished game. The environments are fairly ugly looking. The protagonist is pretty ugly looking, as is the character creator, although you could argue to some extent that that's very intentional on the part of the developers with this whole decaying and dying world. The UI is pretty ugly and clunky. And the game is polished in the sense that the combat is well tuned and well refined and not very buggy. A lot of people, when they talk about hitbox porn, where enemies are attacking exactly where it appears they're attacking, Dark Souls is often cited as one of the best examples of that. But when it comes to the appearance of the game, it's not very pretty. And in fact, before Twitch, I tried to start playing Dark Souls and I couldn't get past the first hour because of how gross the game looked. And not gross from like a nasty, just it didn't look good. It didn't have that Square Enix or Nintendo level of polish that you get accustomed to in games. So I think that on the polished side of that equation, it's not very polished. On the style side, Dark Souls has a style. It's kind of hard to describe what it is, but when you play a game like Bloodborne, which is a Souls-like game, it's from the same developers. It's effectively a Souls game. It's just in a different universe with different names for its mechanics. Like you can feel that it's a Souls game. You see the DNA of the game running through it. And there's already developers out there that are trying to recreate Dark Souls, or make their own versions of Dark Souls, and you can kind of see that same style persist into those games. So I think that it does have style, but it is not stylish, and to some extent that's by design. I think it's something that you'll probably have to overcome if that's something that really draws you to games as polish. Hype to me is kind of a bastardization of Bartle's player type, socializer. So hype is how exciting is a game to talk to other people about. You know how there are some games where you just can't wait to watch somebody's blind playthrough of it on Twitch, or you can't wait to go to work the next day and talk to your coworker about your playthrough. And there are some games where you might enjoy them personally, but it's not something that you're just dying to discuss. And I think that Dark Souls is a very hype-filled game. I mean, it's inspired a big speedrunning community. The blind community for it is extremely active. People love on Twitch to watch people play through the game blind because of the many different ways you can experience it. I think that's really what's different at the end of the day. You can play this game without ever equipping a shield. You can play this game using the starting weapon they give you and never switching it out. You can play this game with a lot of hit points. You can play this game with no hit points. You can go in different directions. It's fairly non-linear. So I think that there's a big attraction when someone tells you, I beat the third boss in the game. You have to say which boss was your third boss and how did you beat them and how many attempts did it take you, right? So I think that Dark Souls is one of the leading games when it comes to talking about hype. If you further break down my category of hype and its origins in socializers, This game is unusual among single-player games in that it has an online component. You play with other people through limited co-op, and they can invade your game more or less against your will. You kind of opt into PvP in the game when you play it, but you don't know when people are going to invade you and ruin your day. And you can read and write messages to and from other players, and that is such a cool mechanic about Dark Souls that I feel like gets lost in discussion about how difficult the game is. It's something that I'd almost like to see in more games, because it frees the developers to obfuscate things in their level design more than I feel like a lot of designers can get away with. They can put an illusory wall in a really weird place that no one has any business checking, or they can put a kind of unfair enemy ambush behind a corner that they wouldn't expect a player to check, because they can rely on other players to write messages in the game world that say things like ambush ahead or illusory wall ahead and things like that. And in most games you would criticize the developer if they did something like that and say, hey, there was no conveyance there. How was I possibly supposed to know that if I stood there that I was going to fall into a hole and die? But the messages free them to do that, and I think that it adds a lot to the game world. It makes you feel connected to other people playing the game. And the fact that they limit the messages that you can write, instead of just having you write whatever you want, you have to choose from pre-selected words and verbs. There's a fun meme community that comes out of that. So absolutely, I think that Dark Souls fits both in the true sense of the word hype and in the socialization sense of it. That takes us out of the audience of this game. Let's now talk about the importance of Dark Souls. Is Dark Souls important to the gaming industry? And I would argue absolutely yes, it is. I think we can see that in the number of developers other than From Software who are making Dark Souls-like games or borrowing ideas from Dark Souls. The fact that Dark Souls has become almost a meme in the industry when referring to games, like this game is Dark Souls hard, or it's the Dark Souls of Metroidvania. That sort of thing we see a lot right now, so I would argue absolutely it's important. And the ways that it's important, I think it's bringing back difficult games, and it's making games difficult again with purpose. There's a lot of older games that aren't difficult because they were made to be that way. They're difficult because it's bullshit, so to speak. Like we said earlier, a game where you have limited continues is really just wasting your time. It's not hard because the gameplay is actually that difficult. It's hard because the game artificially says you only get so many tries before we make you start over from the beginning and waste your time. So it's interesting to be in an era where we're trying to make single-player experiences that are difficult by design instead of incidentally difficult. And I think that that's having a big impact on other developers with games like Nioh and Salt and Sanctuary and some of the other games coming out lately that they eschew the difficulty setting. They just say, our game is hard, deal with it, So absolutely, I would say that Dark Souls is an important game. And quick aside, I'm kind of perplexed at how popular Dark Souls is. I've said this on stream before, but I feel like Dark Souls being popular must have been what it felt like to be into prog rock in the 70s, right? Like, to me, it's like, I love this game, and it has a lot of issues with style and presentation, and it's so hard, it's borderline frustrating that I wouldn't expect a lot of people to be able to play it. It's the kind of game that it feels like it's made for me to enjoy. How can it possibly be that this is so popular? For me, it's like, I love Pink Floyd. I hear Pink Floyd on the radio all the time because it's so popular. It's basically the pop music of the 70s. It's crazy to me that this game resonates with so many people. I have a Dark Souls Solaire hoodie that Propagable, my viewers, recommended I buy. And all the time I'll be wearing it out and people will say, hey dude, praise the sun. And I'll be like, how do you know about this game, right? It's a really interesting cultural phenomenon, I think. So here we want to talk about Dark Souls' strengths and its opportunities. We'll use the business term instead of calling them weaknesses. Opportunities for improvement. And we're going to do a spoiler divider here. So first we'll talk about the game's strengths and weaknesses with no spoilers. We'll cut to a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about it with spoilers. On the strength side, I basically gushed a whole bunch when just talking about the game in general in the audience section. I don't think I have too much else to add that's not redundant, so I won't bore you with repeating the fact that the game is amazing. I love Dark Souls. You should play it. The opportunities side, though, there's a lot of things that Dark Souls could do better, as amazing as it is. Dark Souls has a brilliant system in its Estus flasks. Estus flasks are a healing potion that you have, and when you consume them, if you die, your total number of Estus flasks refreshes. You have a certain maximum that you can consume. You can alter that maximum and how much health they heal through finding things in the game and progressing the story. But fundamentally, you can use those while you're exploring without worrying about needing to save them for the final boss of the game, which is a classic problem that I have, and I hear that's not uncommon among gamers, the never using your resources. I absolutely love this system, and I just wish that it applied to more of the consumable things in the game, right? Because Estus flasks are, to this day, in the Soul series, the only item that works this way. I guess magic spells also refresh when you die or rest at a bonfire, so they're kind of a similar concept. But you get fire bombs, you get homeward bones that let you return to a bonfire. You get all these cool items that, if you're a gamer like me, you're terrified to use them, because what if you need them later? And then, of course, you end the game with 99 fire bombs and 999 arrows, and it was a complete waste in the first place. So I'd love to see Dark Souls change their approach to consumables, take this brilliant idea they came up with the Estus Flask, and apply that more broadly to their items. But that's not really a great weakness to start with, is it? Because it's something that's unique to my playstyle. We already talked about the style being kind of ugly and the UI deserving an improvement, and I think that Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3 helped to address that a little bit. I do think the durability system is a little excessive. The way it works is that your items almost never break until, surprise, they do, and it's a mild inconvenience to repair them. It's interesting because there's design space with durability to have enemies that do things like spit acid on you and break your stuff, like rust monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, and that's a really cool concept, but I don't know that it warrants the system as a whole. Maybe you could do something with a temporary debuff that kind of accomplishes the same thing. Which, related to equipment in general, the upgrade system in Dark Souls is atrocious. I think that the dream in a game like this is to encourage the player to try many different sorts of builds and many different weapons, but the upgrade system encourages you to find a weapon early on, spend your resources on upgrading it, and then stick with that weapon for the entire game, because switching your playstyle requires going back on those investments and investing in something else. It takes the further step of limiting the number of items you can upgrade to the maximum level, so it's even harder for you to try out different weapons. And I think you'll see that if you watch my playthrough, I'm consistently using the same weapons for the whole game, and I wish that hadn't have been the case. The game's pretty praiseworthy for its lack of significant tutorial. It kind of throws you into itself really quickly. There are optional developer messages on the ground that you can read to kind of put you on the right track on what to do. But it has a lot of really key mechanics that the game doesn't really ever explain to you, and I only know about them because I played it on Twitch. But I think it's kind of expecting that you're going to talk about this game with other people who have played it, or you're going to Google it or read a walkthrough. Things like kindling bonfires, which is an action that increases the maximum number of Estus flasks you can carry with you. It's a good chance you won't figure that out for a long time, and it might be by the time you would have figured it out, you've already quit the game because you're frustrated. You can't progress past the first couple areas without more healing. Things like the way the summoning system works. There's a lot of things that are handled with items in Dark Souls 1 that are later handled with UI elements, like writing messages. You might never write a message in your entire first playthrough of the game because it requires an item that you can buy, and it's not entirely clear that that item is infinite use when you see it. So you might say, screw that, I need my souls to level up. I'm not buying that thing, especially if I can only get one of them, right? I don't know how the game could improve that, to be honest, because I think that its lack of tutorial is a huge selling point. Games, especially around the time of Dark Souls 1's release, were getting really excessive with tutorial, where they just would not stop holding your hand. So I think it's both a strength and a weakness that Dark Souls lets you figure it out, encourages that socialization where someone tells you, hey, is this how it works? But if you've not played Dark Souls before and you're playing it for the first time, I encourage you to reach out to someone else who has and ask them for tips as you play. I think you'll have a more fun and enjoyable experience that way. And then Dark Souls has the classic problem where it's so strong and so good at what it does that when it does make a mistake that's unusual, when there is a hitbox that is badly shaped and hits you when it shouldn't have, or when you fall through the game world, or you go to a particularly poorly designed area, it really stands out more than it would have if the game was generally more mediocre. So I think that a game gets a lot of criticism when it fails occasionally because the rest of the game is so stellar by comparison. and I think that's definitely noticeable. I mean, there's nothing worse than dying repeatedly to a boss, and then you're doing really well, and some sort of glitchy action gets you killed. Like, you get impaled by a sword that was nowhere near your body because of a wonky hitbox. But on a positive note, I think that happens really infrequently. It's a surprising thing when it does happen. Here we're going to have a spoiler divide. If you haven't played the game and you don't want spoilers, you want to stop watching the video now. And we're back. So, big spoilery strengths about this game for me include the way that the game changes when you first visit Anor Londo. When you get to Anor Londo, you're probably 10, 15, 20 hours into the game, and you think that you've come really far, but you haven't at all. There's a lot of jokes that the real game begins at or even after Anor Londo when you fight Ornstein and Smough. And I have argued to people before that the ugliness of the early game exists to support what Anor Londo looks like visually. Everything is kind of this boring shade of brown, maybe little bits of green here and there. It really feels decaying, decrepit, and nasty. Everything's dark and dreary. And then you get to Anor Londo, and it's just this huge shock. It's not really what you were expecting at all. And I don't think that contrast would work if the rest of the game had looked as pretty as that area does. And then you find out that the whole area is an illusion. If you kill Guinevere or you kill Gwendolyn, then the illusion goes away and you realize that no, Anor Londo is just as shitty as everywhere else. It's less cluttered, but it's also dark and dreary like the rest of the game world. Just brilliant storytelling. It's so well done, and it's something I worry that a lot of people trying to get into the series will never see because they'll be turned off by how ugly the early game is. The quest to go out and collect the 4 Lord Souls at that point in the game is pretty awesome. Suddenly the game world opens up significantly. I think that's a huge boon, and it's nice to do it after this Ornstein and Smough boss fight, which feels like the hardest boss fight in the game for a lot of people. And it's neat to have all of this freedom suddenly to go in whichever direction you want and explore deeper into this areas that you visited much earlier in the game. The final boss fight against Gwyn in particular really stood out to me. Everything leading up to that point where, you place the Lord Vessel and you walk through the kiln of the First Flame, and you fight the Black Knights that you see there, you get their drops, you're reminded that they're the Knights of Gwyn. Like, the game has really been building up to this confrontation, and you walk in and there's this, old, dying dude with a big fire sword who's at, 0.001% of his power, and he just leaps at you and destroys you in one hit, and there's this very pretty piano music playing. That's generally something that... I don't think that Dark Souls started this trend, but they've definitely popularized it, and it's a very subdued use of soundtrack. I love video game music, as you all know, and I love it because it's so sharply melodic, because back in the day, if you're going to play video game music, you only had a little bit of time to do so. It was going to repeat the same track over and over. You had to make it as minimally annoying as possible, so you wanted to have catchy tunes, and that's why a lot of our early video game music is so rockin'. But Dark Souls uses music very sparingly. It's often silent, but for ambient effects, and music is typically only used during boss fights. And it's, I think, especially well done in the Ornstein and Smough fight and in the Gwyn fight. The level design in Dark Souls as a whole is it's something else. I don't think I really played a game quite like it. It follows this crazy spiral design where very frequently you'll find yourself reaching a ladder or taking an elevator and getting back to where you started via shortcut. And you're like, wow, was I actually almost here the whole time? And the developer and the cult of personality guy, Miyazaki, who's behind Dark Souls, is very careful about making sure that the game world makes sense. There's not TARDIS-like areas that are too big for the zone that contains them. Like, if you see a place off in the distance, it's exactly as far away as it looks. It's not just a wallpaper. And that's a really, really cool element that you don't see from a lot of other developers because they don't really care to do it. This is a game where if you like good level design, the level design in Dark Souls is choice. Now, as far as opportunities for improvement in the late game, I think everybody agrees that Lost Easily is the weakest part of all of Dark Souls 1. both the area and its boss, the Bed of Chaos, are pretty poor in comparison to everything else. And I think a lot of that has to do with budget constraints. It sounds like, I know Miyazaki wasn't happy with the area. The problem is that other than there being all the excessive bloom everywhere, it's just everything that Dark Souls is not, right? It's this gigantic open area. There's not these tight, winding corridors like we're used to. There's tons of enemies everywhere that you're not really intended to fight. The rest of the game, it feels like you're meant to explore through and fight each and every enemy you encounter. There's no real thought, rhyme, or reason to the placement of those enemies. It's just, it feels sloppy, and I think it is the poor mark on an otherwise amazing game. If they ever remaster Dark Souls 1, if they made like a Switch release or something like that, it would be awesome if they revisited Lost Edith and made it slightly less shitty, because it definitely stands out as a problem. And then there's some other really cool late game content that I'm simultaneously impressed that they were willing to obscure it as much as they did, and frustrated that they did obscure it, because I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't have been streaming it on Twitch and people hadn't have told me about it. A couple examples of that include the existence of Gwendolyn as a boss. The way you encounter Gwendolyn requires you equipping a ring that you found on the opposite end of the game while standing in that room. And even with player messages, I think the chance of you discovering that organically is basically zero. I would anticipate the number of people who have fought Gwendolyn without having killed Guinevere, is one way you might fight him if you happen to find that area, is got to be really low, right? They must have just happened to have been using that ring and teleported that bonfire and not really realized what happened. So it's both a strength and a weakness. I'm impressed that they're willing to go to those lengths to hide stuff. There's also the entire like Great Hollow and Ash Lake area, which is super cool and flavorful, and which most players probably will never find. One, because they wouldn't want to go to that edge of the swamp, and two, because it's hidden behind two consecutive illusory walls. But that's a little bit less of a problem, because you can use player messages and you can use the anti-conveyance of, going through an illusory wall and finding nothing significant behind it and thinking there must be more to find here. They use that quite well in some of the later Dark Souls games too. And that brings me to my final thoughts on Dark Souls. It's amazing. You should play it. I honestly think Dark Souls might be my favorite video game series, and I played it for the first time on Twitch. Now, that might be recency bias. And the whole reason I'm doing the review series this way and not assigning things an arbitrary score is because I think it's silly to say that something is your favorite or the best. Like, you can't really compare Dark Souls to Mass Effect. You can't really compare Dark Souls to Earthbound or Chrono Trigger. They're completely different. It's comparing apples and oranges. But I do really like the game, and I'm really excited about playing it. And when the next game comes out, I'm going to want to play it sooner rather than later. I'll be itching to get it on the screen, so to speak. So if you can make it through the kind of ugly visual style of the first game and its perceived difficulty, if you can deal with it being punishing and be willing to fail for a couple hours and possibly not make any progress, then I think that this is a must-play game, and you should check it out. Thanks, everybody.